Well, thanks, Mick. I might move that down. It's nice to stand up. It's freezing. As Mick mentioned, this is one of several synthesis projects. I'll get stuck straight into it. So it's trying to collate the nutrient-related research. C2O Consulting's been contracted by RRRC to help with some of these. And we've obviously worked closely with all of the project leaders to collate this material. This is an example. One of the key synthesis products is a new interactive website for the program. I'm not sure which screen to do. So this is your landing page on the website, and we've got a number of key themes that we've done synthesis products for. We've got working together, the sediment theme, the nutrient theme, which is this one. We've also got a case study around pesticides and other contaminants. Here, I think that's the resilience one. That's the restoration, and then the crown, the COTS. Yeah, it's easier to see on this screen, sorry. So they're the main themes that we've generated specific products for, talking about the nutrient one, and we'll hear from Murray, Carmen and Joe on a couple of the others later today and tomorrow. So a bit of background to the nutrient theme. We all have a fairly good idea of the issues with nutrients in the Great Barrier Reef. I guess water quality is one of the main drivers of current reef health, but in the context of climate change, I guess that's a bit of a different story these days. It's got an important role in ecosystem resilience, so we also know there's interactions between climate change and disturbances, and also then water quality runoff at those times. So having better water quality can help with recovery after those disturbances. Dissolving organic nitrogen and particulate nutrients both pose a risk to the Great Barrier Reef and coastal marine ecosystems. We'll hear a little bit about that tomorrow and this afternoon with the particulate nutrient story in particular. But it's the thing with dissolved in organic nitrogen, it's immediately bioavailable for uptake by plants. We know it causes increased algal growth in some areas. There's a link between DIN and the crown of thorns outbreaks, initiation and maintenance of those outbreaks. There's also, as I said, increased susceptibility to other impacts like temperature, and it can also reduce light because of that algal growth in the water column. The loads have increased over time due to catchment development, so we've seen changes in the catchment that have led to almost, in some areas, doubling of those loads. For at end of catchment, we see that largely in the areas south of Cooktown, so it's less of a story in the Cape, obviously, but as you move into the central and southern Great Barrier Reef, particularly in those areas where you've got cropping in the coastal areas, cane's the dominant land use contributing DIN, and that's largely because of it's the largest cropping land use in those areas. And particulate nutrients can also be sourced from other land uses, so they can become bioavailable. So the nutrients coming from grazing lands are also, we're learning more about that, and we'll hear from Alex about that this afternoon or later this morning. We have seen, I guess, a slow progress towards targets. So end of catchment targets for nutrients have been set, although I will say the report card results that came out this year were pleasing in terms of the rate of improvement. So the management options need to be cost effective, and as Damien said, this research in NESP has really focused on the solutions for reducing nitrogen losses from the catchment. So the sorts of things that have been covered through NESP research, there's a long list up there, and you've heard a little bit about these already from the projects today, but not everybody was able to present. So looking at the enhanced efficiency fertilisers, so Mike's already talked about that, and Tony as well. The integrated decision support tools, so we heard from Eric about an example of that, which has been very successful. John Rolfe led a project looking at cost effectiveness of different projects across in Cane, but also Nathan's looked at the transformation of, I guess, the lower productive cane lands into wetlands and other land uses. Aaron's started his work with establishing a monitoring framework for looking at paddock scale losses of nitrogen, and then they've taken that further as an engagement tool, as he talked about. We've looked, Jim Smart and his team looked at tradable permit schemes, both at a paddock and catchment scale. He wasn't able to come today, but I've got a couple of highlights from that work. Peter Thorburn has developed a prototype insurance product. I never thought I'd learn so much about insurances and how that works. And then the cost effectiveness work that John Rolfe did, but I will say that was done much earlier in the program, so around 2016, looking at the reef rescue. So as I mentioned, each theme that we have for synthesis products has developed a technical synthesis report. So these are all currently with the steering committee and close to finalisation, we hope. They are really highlights of the relevant NESP projects for each of the themes. So if you need or like the detail, you need to go to the individual program reports. But this is very much a high-level summary of if you're interested in nutrients or you're interested in sediments, for example, that's where we would suggest you start. We've got the website and then also specific topics for each theme. For nutrient, we did some particular project work across the management practices. We've also done something to do with the finer scale monitoring learnings and then nutrient risks to the Great Barrier Reef. So as part of that, we generated a framework to try and structure our report. I don't know if you can read that. Basically, we've identified at the top, it's a catchment to, or looking reef, looking backwards actually, we followed the sediment approach. So what are the risks to from nutrients to the GBR? Trying to quantify some of those links, and then looking in the catchment, what are the better ways or what are the solutions for reducing those losses? In that, we have identified a number of clusters of activities that need to occur. So first of all, around identifying actions and projects relevant to that are examples like Mike's work and Nathan's as well. Then looking at understanding participation, so that's largely Aaron's work, Rachel's as well. What are the new instruments? So that's where we've looked at trading schemes, insurances, and then evaluating programs, which is a really important step that often gets left off the end, and that's the work that John Rolfe looked at and made recommendations for future programs. So just stepping through the outcomes from each of those. So nutrient risk to the GBR, a lot of that was done through MatSurf and NERP, and many of you will be very familiar with that work. The focus through NESP was really around the cumulative impacts. So what are multiple stresses acting at the same time, and what's the role of water quality or nutrients in particular when you've got these bleaching events, these large-scale events. They looked at interactions between different water quality variables, nutrients, sediment, as well as pesticides, and increasing temperatures and other impacts. Sven led that work. I think are you presenting on that tomorrow? No? Jo will give a little bit of an overview in her work. In general, those combined stresses led to a worse outcome for the ecosystems. During the extreme bleaching events, though, the results showed that once that becomes quite overwhelming, the signal from water quality is reduced. So that's in these events that we've seen that were unprecedented, I suppose, in the 16, 18 and then in 20. A new water quality index was developed, and we'll hear from Barbara about that tomorrow, I think, looking at as a metric for light. In terms of identifying action, some of the key findings, so we already heard from Mike this morning, so lowering nitrogen rates and using enhanced efficiency fertilisers can reduce nitrogen runoff losses, so he's already talked to us about that, without reducing yields, which is really important. He also showed the effects of site and season specific, so there's a fair bit of variability between the locations that were tested, and they also rely on the crop being able to take up the additional N. The conclusion there, I think, is that they can be successful in some locations. It may be a case-by-case basis, and I think it was highlighted there, we need to look at the economic outcomes of applying those fertilisers. The tools that Eric presented are a perfect example, I think, of how you can use different technologies to work together and generate some solutions for farmers in terms of time saving and efficiency. They demonstrated they can put together some answers to some relatively simple questions, which we probably would have thought would be integrated already into a single tool, and I think that's been a really useful outcome there. The work that Nathan will present, I think, this afternoon is looking at retiring the low yield cane, or the areas with the higher DIN loss. So they mapped out those areas with the highest DIN generation and what the different options for that might be. In looking at that, the most cost-effective option was shifting to wetlands, and he'll talk a little bit about that. And then there was an opportunity to combine that with the credit and trading scheme. So Nathan did quite a lot of work with Jim Smart's team looking at the cost effectiveness of different options and how that could work in with the trading scheme probably at a catchment scale. For understanding participation, I guess the Smarter Irrigation Management Platform showed that you can deliver tailored products for farmers, and that has high outcomes. They're less labour intensive, easy to use, likely to have greater uptake. Aaron's work, as I said initially, established the monitoring framework to support, engagement, participation, and also learning at a paddock scale for water quality outcomes in cane. But also, really importantly, he highlighted some useful outputs of doing that monitoring at a local scale. So having that locally relevant data has been really important, and there's really positive feedback about having that. They've also learned about the appropriate, or using it at multiple scales. So not only do they monitor at paddock, they also monitor at sub-catchment scale and then at the end of catchment, and try and demonstrate those links between scales but also land uses. And then that's been used to work with farmers and develop a bit more trust. So it's not just Aaron pointing to a bunch of work that they necessarily haven't been involved in. It's stuff that they've been involved in, they've helped measure, and they can see the results. The social aspects of that work are, I think, groundbreaking, and it's really made some important steps forward in terms of understanding participation and engagement. So the work that they've, started with is really about building trust, and they've learned about how to do that, which has been a very useful outcome. And having that dialogue between scientists and the growers has been critical. So as Aaron said, he's learned a lot as well, and I think that's an important thing we need to keep reiterating. It's not just about raising awareness with growers, it's also about getting the scientists an understanding of how they work as well. Having them involved in the planning and implementation from the beginning has been a critical element. Also having that continuous interaction as the project goes on, but also having transparent data. So not having a set of information that sets off to the side that doesn't get shared. As far as I understand, everything is shared in that project. The other part of it Aaron highlighted is this takes time, so it's not something that we can all launch into tomorrow. Engagement and working with people in general is something that we need to factor in, both the skill sets but the time and the resources to enable us to do that properly. And also, as he highlighted, it's not just about water quality and biophysical aspects. There's a lot of technology that can be brought in and other skill sets that are important in making it work. For the new instruments, as I said, Jim's work looked at a nitrogen trading market. So that was between landholders in sugarcane catchments. He looked at the Tully in particular. And they showed that you could actually deliver economic and production efficiencies from running a scheme like that. Something like that actually rewards farmers that are doing the right thing, so it has benefits there. But it could also, incentivise innovation and implementation of existing best practices and new approaches. Then he looked at an end of catchment scale, so a nitrogen cap at multiple catchment scales, and trading between, point sources such as sewage treatment plants and non-point sources, so the landholder contributions. They demonstrated with that could be done in a cost-effective way with if you had expansion of activities along the Great Barrier Reef coast, that we wouldn't see an increase of load. So you could manage that load cap with still having some expansion on the GBR coast. Peter's work around insurances, as I said, it was an interesting read. It was looking at insuring against the risk of sugarcane loss from reducing your nitrogen application and if there was a yield loss. The interesting thing about that, I suppose, is it's technically feasible. It'd be very challenging to implement and to commercialise and to get that trust and support from growers. So there'd be a fair bit of education, awareness and just sharing of information to fully understand how that would work to operationalise it. The evaluating programs, so John's work highlighted, as we've seen in other areas as well, there's very large variations in the cost effectiveness between projects and programs. That was particularly the case as you look across regions as well, which is very important. And it highlighted that we really need a better metric and approach for doing that consistently, and which would help with project selection and prioritisation. They're recommending that data on cost effectiveness should be automatically collected for every single project. All research projects, it's also been recommended have an economic component so that you can actually do that cost effectiveness assessment at the end. And then looking at benchmarks, so getting that consistency across regions and programs so that you actually can compare cost effectiveness between programs, projects and locations. So overall, I think the research that's been generated through this theme has been highly valuable. It has, as I said, focused on the catchment side of things and the catchment solutions. It's looked at the higher level instruments, which is quite innovative as well. I guess we could look at, by applying these, we would expect that we'd see some sort of improved understanding of the different applications for overcoming the barriers to nitrogen reductions. Improved water quality tools and protocols will come out of this, as well as the application of new indicators. There's opportunities to combine some of these outputs, I think. So, for example, the trading scheme work, the work that Nathan's done with wetlands, potentially the insurances together with that, and then just the individual practices into, I guess, a model for at a catchment scale, and that's something that needs to be further investigated, I think. And then this sort of work has already been used to inform new programs. So the Reef Trust Partnership has generated some learnings from this. The work that Aaron's done in Project 25 has been extended into a number of other catchments through the Reef Trust Partnership program. And also the Wet Tropics Major Integrated Project has also benefited from some of these learnings already and will continue to do so. Finally, the published peer-reviewed outputs will form important contributions to the next scientific consensus statement and the Outlook report. So there's plenty of applications for this work. So yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thanks for joining us.